Hello and welcome. My name is David Carroll and I am an educational psychologist working with NEPS in the Carlow region. This webinar, Transition in Uncertain Times, has been developed in conjunction with Kilkenny Education Centre. The focus of this webinar is upon the preparation and support of students with ASD as they get ready to move from primary to post-primary school. This is a very broad topic under normal circumstances, but it has been made even more complex due to the arrival of Covid-19. The aim of the webinar is to provide an introduction and an overview to the main considerations that we need to keep in mind as we set about supporting the students. As a single one-off webinar, there are limitations to its scope. This should not be seen as a definitive or exhaustive treatise on the topic. Kilkenny Education Centre has developed a series of webinars in recent times, and on its website there is available a webinar on a similar topic that I would strongly recommend that was delivered by Virga Connery. The webinar is divided into three sections. Firstly, we will be examining transition. What are the issues and challenges that can arise as we move from one environment, one reality to another? In order to help us fully appreciate and better understand these challenges that students with ASD may face as they move to post-primary school, we will take a moment to consider how we as a society cope with our own transition from our established reality to the new normal that we faced with the arrival of Covid-19. Secondly, we will be examining anxiety, how and why it can play such a role for students with ASD as they get ready to move to their new post-primary school. We'll also look at strategies and approaches that might be useful as we help support the students to manage it. Finally, we will examine some strategies and approaches that are evidence-based and have been found to be useful in supporting students as they prepare to transition from primary to post-primary school. This webinar does not have a question and answer facility, though at the end there will be a comprehensive list of all the websites, resources and materials that are listed. Section 1. Time of transition, preparation for a new normal. While we all know that transition entails the changing from one state to another, we might want to take a moment to consider some of the implications that transition can have from an emotional and a behavioural point of view. When one experiences change and transition, it is inevitable but that there will be a degree of uncertainty, a lack of knowing, a lack of predictability. We are moving from an established, familiar reality to a new one. This uncertainty can be difficult for everyone. However, for some people, it might be more stressful and more upsetting. In order to try and help us have a better grasp and understanding of the issues and challenges that this transition, this uncertainty, might pose for children with ASD as they prepare for the move to post-primary school, we might look a moment at our own experience as individuals and as a society as we coped with the change from our established reality, the world we knew, to the new normal of the post-Covid-19 world. And by examining it, we might think about how our behaviour, our physical environment, and our emotions have been impacted. On March 12th, 2020, Ireland began its lockdown due to the arrival of Covid-19. This transition saw us changing our behaviour, changing our social habits, even changing the language that we use. Terms such as flattening the curve, PPE, social distancing, cocooning, lockdown, viral load, all these are in common use today. But from March 12th, Ireland as a society experienced significant change and upheaval. We can think about how this change and upheaval impacted our lives, but also impacted our feelings, our emotions, our grasp of what we thought was normal.
If we examine the impact that COVID has had, the new normal we experienced, we can look at several different ways in which this has occurred. Socially, the way in which we interact with others has changed. The extent to which we have agency or sense of control over our own lives has diminished. Normal established rules have changed quite arbitrarily with no input from ourselves. We have had to learn to adjust and interact in new and novel ways. Our favourite activities have been restricted. Established routines have been curbed. From a physical point of view, our world has become smaller, with many of us working from home. The extent and the manner in which we transport ourselves around has changed. Steps have had to be taken to ensure public health, be that hand sanitisation or the wearing of face masks. Even the physical layout of our towns and cities has changed. The way in which we as individuals and a society as a whole have learned to cope has been quite individual. Some people have taken to exercise with great aplomb, with bike sales reportedly having skyrocketed. Yet at the same time, calorie and alcohol intake is reported to have escalated also. When it comes to how we interact with the media, some of us have been seeking information on a daily basis about the virus, infection rates, death rates, whereas others have embraced entertainment. Connell and Marianne have become household names. Similarly, when it comes to the way in which we shop, online shopping has become more popular. Some people, at the initial stages in particular, stockpiled everything from pasta to toilet roll. Yet there has also been a movement towards sourcing products from local producers. So having looked at how COVID-19 has had a significant impact upon our world, our emotions, our behaviours, with the lack of predictability and the certainty and the structure that we had grown accustomed to, we might be in a better position to consider how students with ASD are facing into their new normal when they arrive in post-primary school in September. They're going to be faced with more and new people, different teachers, a larger, busier school environment, new equipment, all at a time when adolescence is becoming a feature as well. We also need to bear in mind the context in which this transition is occurring. Students have not physically been in school since the 12th of March. They've been out of this routine for up to 6 months. That too is another factor to bear in mind. And then underpinning all of this, we have to bear in mind the context, the concerns, the worries and the limitations caused by COVID. Now there are many COVID specific resources available for children with ASD, and many of them are on the websites which we will see at the end of the webinar. So, for the students moving into their new normal of post-primary school, we can see how socially they will have, as we said, new teachers, new classmates, new subjects, a larger scale of social exposure. There'll be more frequent transitions as they move from class to class. They will have to navigate new rules, new conventions, new cues within that environment. The physical environment itself. There's going to be changes to what were established routines from their primary school days. They're going to have to learn to use lockers, The school bag is going to be different with more equipment, and the school bus can pose its own challenges. They're going to have to be able to negotiate multiple classrooms. They're going to have possibly a longer journey to school, and the school day itself will be longer. Again, as we said, they're going to be using new equipment in a school that operates to a faster pace than which they might have been accustomed to. And then when we look at the coping strategies, it's very much an open-ended question where the individuals will each have their own favourite style. But what we can be reasonably confident in saying is that these questions and these challenges that they pose could well give rise to a sense of apprehension and nervousness. So as we have seen, when we as people move from an established, comfortable, predictable routine into a new reality, it can give rise to a sense of trepidation, nervousness or apprehension. We want to look at that a little bit more carefully. Anxiety is a human response and it is normal. Essentially what it entails is a sense of threat due to a factor in our environment. It serves an evolutionary purpose. It enabled us to respond quickly in an efficient manner to perceived threats in our environment. In moderate amounts, it helps to improve our performance. It leads to the production of adrenaline, which is a natural performance-enhancing drug which enables us to engage in the fight or flight response. However, when one considers anxiety, one must also be aware of the potential risk. If anxiety is unchecked, it can become maladaptive. What we mean by that is, it can be out of proportion to the environmental threat. That means that we could perceive threats that are not there, or we might exaggerate their potential. It can become long-term and habitual. What we mean by that is that rather than anxiety being a response to a specific perceived threat, we could tend to perceive everything as being a threat. If this occurs, anxiety can have impact upon us across several levels. The visual on the right here can show how an anxiety-provoking situation can have a physiological, a cognitive, a behavioural, and an emotional impact. So when we look at the negative impact of anxiety, we might ask ourselves, what exactly does that look like? In general, anxiety tends to lead to avoidance strategies. So essentially, if we find something to cause us anxiety, we do our best to avoid it. Now, this might not be a major issue if the anxiety-causing situation can be easily avoided. If it's meeting with particular people, if it's engaging in a particular pastime, we can avoid that and not have a significant impact upon our overall quality of life. However, if the anxiety-causing scenario is something that is key to our lives, such as going to school, then its impact is of a far greater scale. The negative impact will affect health, well-being, memory, learning, problem solving. So if we look at all those elements and skills, if our memory, our learning and our well-being have been impacted, we're going to be at a disadvantage when we try to solve any problem we might be faced with. This is what we call a negative cycle. So essentially, being anxious about a situation can make it even more difficult for us to use our abilities to address it. So why can this be particularly difficult for children with ASD? Well, there are several reasons as to why children with ASD might be even more vulnerable. Firstly, it would be that of social competence. Children with ASD may struggle with new social dynamics and relationships. They might find it difficult to correctly interpret the social cues. Therefore, making friendships, the building of a support network, or integrating socially might be harder for them to achieve. Secondly, is the whole area of adaptive functions. Children will require support to adapt previously learnt everyday school behaviours to the new environment. The whole area of creating new routines and developing schools in the post-primary setting. So for example, in the primary school, their skills were reasonably well developed by the time they finished 6th class, but now we're looking at a whole new range of challenges around looking after their belongings, lunchtime, personal organisation, communication skills and relationships. All these can pose new challenges. Another area would be the whole element of comorbidity. Research would indicate that approximately 40% of children with ASD can have other conditions such as ADHD or behavioural difficulties. These can bring a whole new level and greater challenge for the level of self-management and emotional regulation that post-primary school requires. So, research conducted by Mandy et al. When identifying areas that can give rise to difficulties at this time of transition focused in on anxiety about the unknown, change, different rules and processes in addition to excessive social anxiety caused by social difficulties. If you look at the visual at the bottom right hand corner of your screen, those of you might be familiar with the NEPS continuum of support. This is a useful framework to apply to supporting all students at all times of their school life, not just ASD students and not just at the time of transition. This framework will enable schools to capture and address the needs ranging from relatively minor to more significant, from transitory needs to more established, long-lasting ones. And this framework is the one which we recommend to be applied when devising support plans for the student. So before we move on about management of anxiety, there's a few little considerations we might want to give a minute to think about. So we have two quotes here. Firstly, from Dr. Stephen Shore, if you've met one person with autism, you've met one person with autism. Each person is unique and individual. Each person with autism is unique and individual with their own needs, strengths and profile. Each student may need a tailored individualised plan useful for them and meaningful to them. And schools need to plan for everyone's well-being on induction. And children with ASD may need extra support. So the central point there is that there is no one-size-fits-all plan. Every student transitioning will need some level of support. Children with ASD will possibly need more individualised support, but each individual with ASD will need their own individualised plan potentially. Secondly, a quote from Rosa Parks, knowing what must be done does away with fear. Essentially what we're getting at here is that the greater the level of information and clarity and predictability we have about something in advance, it means that there are fewer potential threats that we might perceive. If there are fewer threats, if there are fewer gaps in our knowledge, then there is less reason for us to be anxious. So the general takeaway point from that would be, the more we can make things predictable, the less anxiety should be provoked. This is where we come to the crux of the issue in the current circumstances. Presently, in our Covid-19 reality, there are huge gaps in our knowledge about what school life will look like in the new term. When will schools open? What will timetables look like? What public health considerations might have to be borne in mind? So we will get this information closer to September when schools are ready to open. But as it stands now, we can't. So we would be best using our time to look at some strategies that have an evidence base behind them and have been found to be helpful. So as we said, this should be looked at as a sample of some of the strategies that can work rather than a prescriptive or exhaustive list. So, in looking at a sample of some of the strategies that have met with success before, 2 points really to bear in mind. First off, again, to repeat the point, this is not an exhaustive list, this is just a sample of approaches that have been found to be beneficial. Secondly, would recommend that these be normalised and try to inbuild them into the student's daily routine, not just as a standalone part of a separate induction process, but rather to be drawn upon and used into the future as part of the student support plan. So the strategies we will look at in turn are identify, measure and manage. Next we'll be looking at progressive muscle relaxation, then breathing exercises. We'll look briefly at stress kits with a video from Middletown Centre for Autism, and we will also look at the benefits of physical exercise and calming activities. Identify, measure, manage. Essentially what this strategy draws upon is the whole area of emotional literacy and its role in supporting students in understanding their emotions and then controlling them. Essentially, the logic behind this is that before one can successfully respond to anxiety, one must first be able to identify it and name it. Secondly, you have to be able to measure it, quantify it, and to differentiate its various extents. And then finally, have developed a repertoire of strategies that the person can be confident can help. So, firstly, if you look at identify, now this is a key skill, and a certain degree of patience and persistence might be needed at this stage in particular, as it might not be easily grasped initially. The idea here is to help the student to identify the ways in which their body tells them that they are anxious. Now, an approach that's used again and again when working with students with ASD is the use of visual reinforcers. So, what might be worth trying in this instance would be a visual chart or body map. And on this map, the student can draw what the cues or identify the ways in which their body communicates with them when they're anxious. So it could be shortness of breath, it could be tingling sensation in their tummy, it could be sweaty palms, it could be a dry mouth, it could be a feeling of nausea. So the student can record all the various ways in which anxiety affects their bodies, how their body is telling them that they are feeling anxious. So once we've identified anxiety within the person, the next step is to measure or quantify it. Again, a visual resource can help the student gauge and also communicate with others the extent of their anxiety. So there is a huge range of different resources available online, and essentially there are different ways of doing the same thing. So they're called at times a feelings ladder, a scale, or another one that I've used a lot in my practice is the use of the feelings thermometer. The incredible 5-point scale is another resource that teachers have reported to use very, very successfully. Essentially what this entails is that the student estimates how high their anxiety is on their feelings thermometer, for example. So green would indicate a state of calmness, up to yellow and orange as they feel more uncomfortable, and red when they're feeling particularly uncomfortable or anxious. Once the student has identified the extent of their feelings, they can then, having identified it, identify where they want to be, how they want to lower their feelings thermometer, lower their reading, and manage their anxiety. The last stage then would be the student engaging in a repertoire of activities and resources that they know can serve to lower their levels of anxiety. The subsequent strategies essentially look at developing this repertoire of this box of tricks to help them manage their anxiety. Progressive muscle relaxation. This essentially involves the contraction and relaxation of sequences of muscle groups, holding it for several seconds and then letting go. So the student would be supported in working through a routine, again using visual supports and a script if needed, through ordered sequences. So for example, one might start with fists, move on to the arm muscles and then shoulders, or perhaps toes, calves, thighs, etc. This routine should be designed so that it can be carried out in a calm environment while seated. So in other words, it can be engaged with in the classroom with minimal disruption. A real key point here is that the progressive muscle relaxation should be introduced, should be taught, and the student should be supported in rehearsing it in a calm, controlled environment, rather than introducing it when the student is actually feeling anxious. It should be made a regular part of the daily routine, rather than just being used in a responsive manner to when the student is feeling anxiety. And as we said before, visual prompts can be key in making it more accessible. The visual prompts on the right are from Vanderbilt University in Nashville, and the link is available at the end of the webinar. Those visuals come with a script that the teacher and student can engage with as they progress themselves through the order of exercises. So as you can see, squeezing a lemon involves the hand muscles, stretching like a cat, the shoulder muscles, and so on. Breathing exercises. The student can learn how to control breathing when feeling anxious, as this can significantly reduce stress. Now, this particular type of breathing is called diaphragmatic breathing or belly breathing, and it's somewhat counterintuitive in that when you inhale you push out your belly, and when you exhale you suck it in. This type of breathing is more efficient than conventional chest breathing, and the key point is this: it's the manner in which it can help control hyperventilation. If you can control hyperventilation, you can slow your heartbeat. And if the heartbeat is moderated, this can promote a sense of physical comfort. So what this does essentially is to counteract the physical symptoms of anxiety. Again, it should be introduced, taught, and be well rehearsed in a calm, controlled environment before being used when the student feels anxious. And again, consideration should be given to the use of visuals, and online you will find different approaches to essentially the same skill, like milkshake breathing, smell the flower, or blow out the candle, and these can make it more accessible for the young person. Middletown Centre for Autism is a cross-border initiative. It will be regarded as an international centre of excellence for all things related to ASD, and a huge source of training and resource for teachers and parents alike. I'd strongly recommend that you spend time familiarising yourself with their website. Details again are listed at the end of the webinar, but here is an example. This brief video explains the operation and benefit of stress kits.
A stress kit is a useful resource to use with your students when you notice them becoming stressed, anxious, frustrated, or dysregulated. A stress kit is normally a small box or container or a portable bag that contains items that you know are engaging and motivating for your student to use. A stress kit is usually created by the teacher who knows the student well and therefore will know what items the student will find enjoyable. A stress kit can also be created in collaboration with the parent and the young person themselves, so they may choose what items that they put into their stress kit. It's a nice idea to get the student to decorate the front of the stress kit so that they have active participation in developing the stress kit. Some of the items that may be used in the stress kit can be sensory-based items, fidget items, or items related to the child's special interest. A sensory item may be something like a squeeze ball that the child can manipulate in their hands. The child might like to use a small clapper, clicker, or a spinning top that they can watch on the desk. For this child, there was also a small mini beast and a book that they enjoyed reading related to their special interest and that they found calming. A stress kit should be kept in a designated safe area, and the child should have access to it at all times. The child may transition to this area to use the stress kit, or the stress kit can be brought to the child's desk for a few minutes where they can then use this to help them calm down.
Physical exercise and calming activities. Now, as we have said already, all these plans have to be very individualised. That activities that help and serve to reduce anxiety can and will vary significantly from student to student. So there's no such thing as having a pre-arranged, one-size-fits-all support plan for all students on the spectrum. A few pointers that you should bear in mind when trying to devise a plan would be: number one, take time to identify the type of activities that work and the dosage that works best. So from this point of view, information from parents, from the students themselves, and from their previous school can be really, really important about getting the right match between the activity and the dosage or the amount of it. Exercise has shown to improve social skills, self-regulation and behavioural skills across many international studies. And Carlow IT has a very well established record in this area in particular. They also operate some school-based projects to support students across the region. Again, there are links at the end of the webinar to these websites. Another thing to be mindful of would be how to differentiate. Students with ASD can have underdeveloped motor skills and fitness levels. So even something like basic fundamental movements, walking, running, jumping, can have benefits rather than more elaborate, complicated PE sessions. Surplus to physical exercise, things like deep pressure, sitting on an exercise ball, drinking through a bottle with a sports cap, use of a trampoline, heavy work, reading favourite comic books, listening to favourite music, whatever might work for the individualised student should be captured in the student's plan. And what I would say would be that in regards to these issues, advice from an occupational therapist can be extremely helpful. Post-primary school, preparing for transition. So we're moving into the final stage of the webinar, and this stage deals with the actual transition plan, how we support the student as they move from primary to post-primary school. And a few points to bear in mind as we set about this. First off, we need to be aware that the key to a successful transition plan is the information and how it is shared. So the more valid information we have that we can provide to all parties, especially the student, then the lesser the uncertainty, the greater the predictability, and the more likely they will meet with success. The next point to be aware of is that any information that is shared should be shared in two directions, between home and school and vice versa. This information essentially means that the school will be familiar and will be made aware of the key details and key information coming from the student, from the student's family, and from the student's previous primary school. Similarly, the student and the student's family, with information that is provided by the post-primary school, will be in a better position to prepare themselves and will be aware and familiar with what they will face in September. Now, as we mentioned already, there are certain aspects of this change, this transition, that are stable, that are predictable. These aspects look like the student's preferences, the student's learning style, the teachers and the staff that the student will work with in September. These should be predictable and be relatively stable. However, there are other elements that are less predictable and may change between now and September. Things like school transport arrangements, physical distancing, timetabling. All these things are liable to change between now and September, therefore making it that bit more difficult to fully implement and design a transition plan at this stage because of the gaps in our knowledge. These gaps should be filled in over time as we get closer to the reopening of school. So, in order to set about preparing a transition plan as things stand, there are three broad aspects that we will consider. First off, we're going to very briefly look at some publications and references that have been used and are used on an ongoing basis to support students at this stage, making the transition from primary to post-primary school. Secondly, we're going to look at specific approaches and strategies that are used in general circumstances. So these are the type of evidence-based approaches that have found to be helpful as students move from primary to post-primary school in normal times. And finally, we're going to look at more specific considerations due to the current COVID-19 circumstances. So that is what we're going to be looking at in the next few slides. General approaches around transition. So, first point here, point A, looking at resources. There are two documents in particular that I would like to draw your attention to. First is a NEPS HSE joint document from 2015. That's the Transition to Post-Primary School Sample Transition Programs. This document is very useful, very practical. It's a good practice guide to aid schools and families and students as they make the switch to post-primary school, and there's a sample program there that can be tweaked and amended to the specific needs. The second document there on your right in red is an NCSE document supporting students with special education needs to make successful transitions. Both these documents are available online, and the web links are provided at the end of the webinar, and both are well worth examining, as there's some very, very useful materials contained there. Point B, approaches. So we have said already that there have been and there continues to be a wealth of resources and documentation devised around COVID-19 through an ASD lens, and the websites that are cited at the end of the webinar are very good sources for these COVID specific supports, and we will look at some other materials as part of the webinar towards the end. But our immediate focus here will look at these evidence-based approaches that are applicable generally and are not limited to the current circumstances. So the actual approaches we will look at in turn are the student profile, social stories, how to give the student a voice in school, academic challenges, and environmental challenges and sensory needs. So as we said before, this is not an exhaustive list. These are just samples of some approaches that have met with success. Student profile. So as we mentioned on the previous slide, one of the key determinants of the success of a transition plan is the information that is shared and also how the information is shared. Student profile is a simple, efficient, concise way of helping the staff who will work with a student better understand his needs and how to support him or her. It entails the development of a one-page profile about the student to help the school meet their needs and try to promote a consistent approach to supporting the student. In other words, every staff member will be singing off the one hymn sheet. They will have the similar information to hand and should be adapting similar approaches. This person-centered planning approach is aiming to capture the students' strengths, their needs and their capabilities in a very efficient manner. It should be framed in positive language and focus on skills rather than having the focus on what the behaviours look like. So for example, sharing information with staff along the lines of the student prefers their own space when playing might be more appropriate than wording it in a way such as the student may hit out when others try to get involved in the game. This information should be shared with all staff working with the student. So this information should not be ring-fenced just with, for example, the specific teacher who is allocated to an ASD unit perhaps. Also, the student profile tends to work best when school, parents and student are involved in its drafting. So it should not be developed and presented as a finished article to a teacher. It should be really embraced at the design and drafting stage so that everyone understands all the sources of information and its relevance. So here we can see an example of a one-page student profile. It really shouldn't be much longer than one page. At the centre it should have the child's name or picture so that the staff are familiar with whom they will be working, and the type of information entailed should or could involve things like what the student is working for, what the overall educational aim is, what works, how you can help. In other words, the student's learning style and preferences. A key thing to do as well would be try to put down information that will help the student and staff for times when the student may be dysregulated or uncomfortable. Emphasis should be placed on the student's strengths and skills, and then some detail also included about the nature of any difficulties that the student might be likely to experience. So there's quite a lot of information contained on quite a small platform, and it should be made as efficient and concise as possible and should be shared with all staff who work with the student. Social stories. Social stories were devised initially by Carol Gray in New Zealand in 1991. They are a tool to help students with ASD to cope and learn how to manage situations that they might otherwise find difficult. Social story is a short description of a particular situation or activity or event or a skill. The social story takes the form of a document. the student can be involved in the drafting of this document, and the social story breaks the situation or event or skill down into smaller sequential steps, and the story describes and explains whatever it is that the young person will face. At its core, the social story acts as a roadmap to help guide the student as they try to navigate the situation. It can be used to introduce a concept, to support the student as they rehearse, and then as a reinforcer when the student encounters the situation in a natural setting. Pre-designed social stories and templates of social stories are available online. However, social stories have a real strength in that they are very, very flexible, and one can devise individualized stories that can be tweaked, updated and amended over time. Now, social stories can be very visual in nature, and as I said in the previous slide, online there is a vast array of examples and templates available. Carol Gray's own website is listed at the end of the webinar. So as we mentioned earlier, there are pre-designed social stories available to address specific skills. However, the real beauty of social stories is that using a camera or even your phone, you have in your hands the capability of devising a social story for almost any scenario under the sun. Very, very flexible, and if the student responds well to social stories, it can be a huge resource in helping them negotiate things like locker spaces, meeting people for the first time, veiling of the transport to get to school. Very, very flexible tool, and one that can be of huge assistance to the student. Enable students to have a voice. So as mentioned earlier in the webinar, the whole aspect of social competence and the whole manner in which anxiety can have a significant impact upon students with ASD as they move into post-primary school. Due consideration should be given to how best support the students in having their voice heard in school. If not, if we have that sense of lack of agency or control, you could give rise to a sense of isolation and a lack of engagement from the student. Some of the strategies that we might look at here would be, to begin with, that of choice or illusion of choice. So, what this looks like would be, essentially, instead of giving a direct instruction to a student as to what it is they're expected to do, which can give rise to a sense of foreboding or anxiety, would be to present a task as an option to the student. So in other words, instead of telling the student what to do, inform them that they have a choice of either A or B or C. The key here is that the student has a sense of agency and choice. They're less likely to be passive but to be proactive in making the decision. But also, each of the options that have been provided are desirable in that they will lead to the achievement of what is the aim of the lesson. This can help to reduce the anxiety, establish that sense of control for the student, and also help achieve the educational outcome. Another issue that we might want to look at would be to be aware in advance that the act of raising one's hand, drawing attention to oneself and asking a question, which might be the traditional manner and method of post-primary school, might not work for an awful lot of students with ASD in the post-primary school setting. If that is the case, then by working in advance with the student, the student's family, the student's previous school, identify what will work. Are there other ways in which the student can draw attention to themselves, perhaps more discreetly, perhaps in a different or more visual manner? But just to give consideration to that, because that can cause difficulties. The next point would be the whole area and the benefits from having regular one-to-one check-ins with members of staff. So as we said, if there is a potential risk of a student being passive and not voicing their concerns or feelings or thoughts about a particular issue, if there is a regular timetabled facility for the student to interact with the teacher, then there's far less likelihood of what might be a small or relatively trivial issue to begin with from manifesting into something of far greater significance. So by getting in there early, issues can be addressed rather than leave them fester. Another issue to be looked at when we're looking at communication skills of students with ASD, consideration to the use of alternative means to communicate. So if the student is less likely to interact effectively verbally with the teacher, can they use other means? Can we get the end result by use of a different approach? So that could perhaps take the form of an email, a video call, or more visual approaches like development of a cartoon strip. As with all these strategies that we've looked at so far in the webinar, key thing is to get the information, share it in advance, devise the plan, rehearse it and support the student before the student is expected to perform it independently in what might be perceived to be a pressurised environment of the school. And one last point, and this is a point that was addressed when we looked at the student profile, is the importance of having a protocol agreed and practiced for what is to be done when the student feels dysregulated or overwhelmed. So if there is an existent protocol that people are familiar with, students and staff are going to be in a better position to respond appropriately. Academic challenges. One of the key differences between primary and post-primary school is the nature and the extent of the academic load, the expectations that are placed upon the student. So what we want to look at briefly here would be a sample of some of the type of challenges and academic skills that the student will be expected to undertake. We might look at some of the means that tend to work for the students and how we might support them, and then some general principles about how we as teachers and parents might set about supporting the students. So on the left here we can see some of the key points that might need to be addressed in school would entail the student's ability to, for example, navigate the school environment. Secondly, their ability to complete written assignments and to complete them on time. Point C, how well able are they to revise for exams? What are their study skills like? How are they prepared to physically sit and complete an exam? Next, the completion of projects on time. How are they able to plan and successfully engage with after-school activities? And another key point is to what extent the student is ready and able to respond positively to feedback from teachers once their work has been corrected. Now at the bottom of the page you might see some of the key means that we should bear in mind to help the students cope with these would be that of visual learning strategies, scheduling, in other words, providing them with a list and an ordered sequence of the tasks they have to undertake, and also an approach called mind mapping. Now there is a link at the end of the webinar to Tony Buzan's website in that regard, but they're some of the means. And it's very important that both the staff and the student familiarise themselves with that type of approach. But no matter what the specific skill is, whatever the specific academic challenge is, one of the key skills that they will have to master in order to successfully engage with the academics is that of executive functioning. Now, there are recommendations and guidelines around executive functioning available on the NEPS website, which is cited at the end of the webinar, but when we speak about executive functioning, what we mean essentially is one's ability to perform tasks independently. That has many components. Your planning skills. Do you know what equipment you need? Do you know how you start a task and how to finish the task? Your organisational skills. Do you have the proper equipment? Do you have the proper time management skills? Are you able to prioritise? Can you avoid the pitfall of overly focusing on maybe one small trivial aspect of an overall task? Your working memory. To what extent are you able to juggle several sources of information at the one time whilst coming up with a solution to a problem? And then there's the whole area of metacognition, and by that we mean one's ability to think about one's own work. To what extent can you be objective and look at what you're doing and how you are doing it? So, as we said, there are many academic challenges, and instead of trying to go through each one in exact detail, NEPS guidelines would recommend that you try to stick to some key principles for all the strategies. So, we have them set out on the visual on the box on the right hand side, and there's 5 points that we'd recommend that you bear in mind. Firstly, try to teach the skills specifically, so discreetly and ring-fenced the actual skills, to break them down and to teach them explicitly to the student. Secondly, where possible, try to remind the student with a list of what it is they have to achieve, or even better, try to make it more visual in the form of a schedule. Number 3, encourage personal mastery. Place an emphasis on the development of the skills. Try to establish routines so that it becomes a habitual way in which the student undertakes tasks. Break down larger tasks into smaller, more manageable steps so they can see the progress that they're making. Where possible, build in choice. Rather than giving direct instructions to the student, try to encourage a sense of agency in their own learning, where they get to make choices and decide preferences. Negotiate, engage with the student so they can think out loud about what it is they're doing and why they're doing it. And then, the metacognitive part, try to encourage the student to rate their own skills, to see can they identify what might make their work even better. Another point to bear in mind would be that of the provision of support. Provide support until the student has gained mastery, but then do not assume that that box is ticked and then abruptly withdraw the support. Fade it over time so that the student learns to become more confident and more able. And finally, try to move from an external to an internal locus of control. What we mean by that would be, instead of the student performing for the purpose of praise or a concrete reward, try to see can the student perform so that they're self-motivating, that completion of the task is seen as a desirable outcome and reward of itself. Environmental challenges and sensory needs. As I Am are an ASD advocacy group founded by Adam Harris. Just want to read a quote here before we move on to this aspect of the webinar. Many autistic people also have triggers, certain sensory experiences which can cause real distress and discomfort. As a result, many environments are immensely uncomfortable or inaccessible for autistic people. The consequence is autistic people being cut off from public services, businesses and leisure activities, denied the right of access that other people can take for granted. Now, if we take that quote and put in the word education, I think it's equally valid. As we said, the post-primary school is a more frenetic, faster paced environment than the students coming from primary school might be used to. So, what can be done to help solve this issue or address the difficulties that might arise? Well, the As I Am website, again listed at the end of the webinar, has a tool there. Essentially, it is an environmental and sensory checklist. You can see a sample of it there in the visuals. What it does is it looks at the various factors that are addressed, be it visual, noise and hearing, balance and hearing, communication, exiting and withdrawal options, and touch and feel. And what it does, it goes in great detail, citing examples of what it regards as good practice, what tends to work for students with autism. The school, using this checklist, can look at what would be regarded by As I Am as good practice, and then detail what the current reality in their school environment is, to see how it compares and contrasts with best practice. And then the final column would enable the family, student and school to explore possible solutions to try and address these issues. So if this is done in advance of the school reopening, the student is far more likely to hit the ground running and sidestep some of the issues that might crop up for them. So this complete auditory, tactile, multisensory checklist is available on their website, and it is a very, very useful tool and a worthwhile exercise for all parties to engage with prior to school reopening. I would highly recommend it, and again is at the end of the webinar. Considerations specific to current circumstances. So here we're moving on to the last element of the webinar, and we're going to spend some time looking at some strategies and approaches and considerations relevant to a time of Covid-19. Now, an awful lot of the materials here would be found on Tony Atwood's website. Again, it's listed at the end of the webinar. Very good resource available on the website around ASD in general, but some new resources specific to Covid-19 have been added and continue to be added regularly. So just to go through the points in order. Spend some time trying to foster school-home communication and links during lockdown to provide that bit of reassurance, but also to set the precedent for what an appropriate and a successful style of communication that might work for both parties into the future. Don't let things sit until school opens. Next part, we're looking at the whole area of parental self-care and the modelling of behaviour. If we are hoping to support our young people around managing anxiety, self-care, self-soothing behaviours, personal organisation, then it is important that we model that behaviour ourselves. Another key point to bear in mind is being a teacher is not easy. Being a parent is not easy. Self-care is going to be key. If we're not looking after ourselves, we're not going to be in the best position to support the young people in our charge. So when you think of when we are on airplanes, if we ever get on one again, one of the first things that the air stewards show us is how to apply our own oxygen mask before we try to support any children and put their mask on. So there's two pieces here that are coming highly recommended. Number one is an RTE app, UK, which basically is a self-care and mindfulness app and is getting very, very good reviews. And secondly, specific to school staff and teachers, would be the Employee Assistance Service. It's now called Inspire Workplaces. So that resource is available free to charge for staff as they set about what is a challenging piece of work. Just to bear in mind the whole area of self-care and appropriate modelling of behaviour. The next point. Once clarity has been brought to the return of school and the details, the gaps in our knowledge that we've mentioned already, when those gaps are filled in, try to let the parents know in advance what the student's first day in particular will look like, so that it can be introduced at home. They can start talking about it and they can start readying the student, rather than landing it on them suddenly. Gradually introduce the idea. Again, if social stories work, if scheduling works, try to devise those in advance so the student gets the information, the student has a degree of clarity and certainty brought in, and that should serve to hopefully reduce potential anxieties and enable them to meet with success when they try to negotiate that scenario. Again, the whole area of choice and the provision of options. So, for the student potentially to arrive at or leave school earlier than other people on their first day, try to reduce that potential for sensory overload. With the hundreds of young people around, the buses, the cars, the noise, the excitement of children meeting friends for the first time in a long time, try and control, try to limit the potential for sensory overload on day one in particular. A key thing here is to make staff aware of the potential impact of noise level upon the student. So this is where the student profile card can be useful, and the sensory checklist from the As I Am website could be useful. But noise is one particular sensation that can cause particular difficulty. The frequency with which the bell goes in post-primary school is different to primary school because of the amount of change from class to class. So give some time to see how might we mitigate that. Try to allow for increased calming breaks and activities during the initial week back. So the key thing in the initial stages is trying to get the student bedded in. Make sure they are as calm and as comfortable as possible. So the academic load, the curriculum, is not the priority at the beginning of the year. Make sure that they can settle in and be comfortable in their new environment. That should be your guiding star for the first weeks of the school year. Now, that is the end of the actual webinar. I'd like to thank you all very much for your attention. Any queries that you have, please feel free to contact me via the Education Web Centre or else your own school's NEPS Psychologist. But please stay here for a few moments more as we'll just briefly fly through some of the websites and resources that we have discussed already. Slán go fóill. To begin with, we're just going to look at some of the websites that we've mentioned. So des.ie, that's the Department of Education and Skills, and the NEPS page is contained on that website. You will find a lot of resources and materials. In particular, there have been an awful lot of well-being and ASD specific resources put online over the past few weeks and months, so that is well worth checking out. As I Am, that is the Adam Harris organisation. That's where you'll find a sensory and environmental checklist. They also have recently put up materials for summer learning programs for students with ASD that was just launched in early July. The NCSE is another website with an awful lot of very good stuff and useful materials, especially that red document we mentioned around the transition to post-primary school. Carol Gray Social Stories, so that is from the creator of the original Social Stories, but I would really emphasise that Google, Pinterest, any of these can be equally good when it comes to using social stories, but personally speaking, I found that the most successful social stories are those that were developed just with a mobile phone, a computer and a printer. Middletown Autism is a fantastic repository of all materials, resources and trainings related to ASD. Really worthwhile materials there. I would strongly recommend that. TonyBuzan.com, that's a website where mind mapping and kind of visual learning exercises are explained and can be very useful. Tony Atwood again, huge resources available for all things related to ASD, and some very useful COVID specific materials have been put up there also. Vanderbilt is the Nashville, Tennessee University. They had the visuals and the script for the progressive muscle relaxations. The NCSE, as we've mentioned their website already, but they have themes of the week, and the link there will bring it to one on transition and change. SAM is an app devised by the University of the West of England in Bristol. It's for use on your mobile phone, and it helps individuals measure their level of anxiety and also implement coping strategies to help them work themselves through any difficult episodes. That's a very useful tool to have. And then the NBSS, that's National Behaviour Support Service, part of the NCSE now, but they have very well developed materials around social and emotional literacy that would be particular around the whole area of anxiety and coping skills. And just to finish up, here are some of the publications that made reference to in the course of the webinar. The Incredible 5-Point Scale, that is a book that a lot of teachers find very useful, particularly around the whole area of emotional literacy and using visual strategies to support students around that. The next two pieces are a piece of research carried out in Carlow IT, and I would like to give special mention to Carlow IT. They're doing some very interesting work around the benefits of physical exercise and health for children with ASD. So their website, again, the health core element of their website, I'd strongly recommend. And the last two pieces of research are also cited. They were very useful in the preparation of today's webinar.